do I say? Except thank you to the organizers for organizing this great event, and thank you for asking me to come and share my views on radical organizing. Let me start off by saying that they really did a very positive thing from my perspective in terms of saying, hey, Chuck, you can come and talk about whatever you want to talk about as long as it relates to radical organizing. So I say that to say that they have this little disclaimer on a radio show that the ideas that are being expressed are totally my ideas and are not claimed by the organizers of this conference, although I hope that they fit together. Let me start off by saying that I'm going to try to talk a little less than a half hour in order to help get back on the program. But I think it's important to look at a number of issues in terms of creating a framework in our minds in terms of what we mean when we talk about radical organizing, how we evaluate whether the work we're doing is really fitting, our definition of radical organizing, and again, just looking at the method that we come together across our issues in terms of not only looking at radical organizing as a focus on a particular issue, but looking at how radical organizing pulls us together around the spectrum of issues that we focus on. I thought it would be helpful to start off with a definition, and when I went to the dictionary, I said it was really an interesting set of definitions of the word radical. One, relating to or proceeding from a root, as growing from the root of a plant, growing from the base of a stem, from a root-like stem, or from a stem that does not rise even above the ground, relating to linguistic root, mathematical root, root of a disease. So it's all about the roots. Two, relating to the origin, fundamental. Three, marked by a considerable departure from the usual or traditional. And then they have extreme in bold letters. B, tending or disposed to make extreme changes in existing views, habits, conditions, or institutions. C, of relating to or constituting a political group associated with views, practices, and policies of extreme change, advocating extreme measures to retain or restore a political state of affairs. And in slang, and this is perhaps the best definition of radical, they say excellent, cool. So whenever anyone says to you, what does it mean to be a radical organizer? Just tell them it means that I'm a cool organizer and an excellent organizer in addition, if not extreme. So start off there to say that the difference between organizing, say in the Linsky model, getting people together around different neighborhood issues, street signs, etc., conditions in stores, and radical organizing, is that the radical organizers are focused on organizing that goes to the root of the problem. Radical organizers are not focused on putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. Radical organizers are not focused on getting stop signs when the issue is the traffic system in a city. Radical organizers don't look at the question of how a particular landlord is operating as the answer, and changing that behavior as the answer. A radical organizer looks at our system of handling housing, and whether that handling of housing is moving in a direction that talks about decent, adequate housing for all. That's the difference. So in many ways, I think you could find organizers who are using tactics that people might say are extreme, but they aren't radical organizers, right? That is, you can have organizers who are doing things that are confrontive, that are pushing around a particular issue, but that is not what makes them radical. What makes them radical is their vision and whether they see the achievement of the reform as the end of the work, right? What is the end of the work? What is the end of the work? Let me put out a what some might consider a radical idea. I think it's just very reasonable. I think ultimately radical organizing is trying to create a planetary system of equality and justice for all. A planetary system of equality and justice for all. Because as Judy and our other speakers pointed out, there's an interrelatedness between us. We're all human beings on this globe together. How could we have a quality of life that we could feel good about if we know that quality of life is being sustained by the oppression of others? You know what I mean? While Americans don't want to admit it, we do have to acknowledge that each and every one of us, whether we're radical organizers or not, we are the problem. We are the problem for the rest of the world, right? So that means that radical organizers understand that we are part of the problem and that we have to change the way we function as a country and as human beings within the country. Otherwise, it's not radical organizing, because if we have activities going on in this country that promote justice and equality, but they're being financed in many ways by resources that we're taking from the world, what kind of justice is that? That's just Americanism with maybe a black face or Latino face and an Asian face in addition to the white face, right? That's not what we're about when we talk about radical organizing. It's about creating justice for all. The question, let's put it in the context, though, of this country. Radical organizing is to take the vision in the Declaration of Independence and use it to transform the government that has developed out of the Constitution. Let me say that again. I believe that radical organizing is to take the vision of the Declaration of Independence that talked about equality for all and use that vision to challenge a constitution not only that defined people of African descent as less than human, but also said women weren't able to vote. Why? Because women didn't have the sense to make good decisions as citizens. Even if you were a white man and didn't have any property, you couldn't vote. Why? Why? Because that shows that you didn't have the intelligence to have the right to vote. Right? That's the Constitution. That's the fundamental law of this country. And that fundamental law led and leads to the practices that we see. If you look at the Constitution, there is no guarantee of economic rights. Why? This country was not set up to give economic rights to all. That wasn't the purpose, right? This country was set up to give very consciously. I'm not talking, this isn't a radical view. I don't believe, I think you just read the documents. This country was set up to allow a certain group of people to have control over everybody else. It was set up to be a slave state, right? And so while there's been a struggle, yeah, you clap. While there's been a struggle to move forward that has brought changes, what we have to appreciate is that when we look at the practices of our society, we are still looking at practices, forms of interrelationship that are built on the assumptions in the Constitution of inequality. If you think about, I was a batterers treatment counselor for 7 years, working with men of all races who had been sent by the court to spend a year with myself and other counselors, looking at their attitude and behavior. I know for that was in the 90s, I know based on that work that the framework of thinking and action of males and the society in general is still connected to that other reality in the Constitution that said women couldn't vote. In fact, women didn't get the vote until 1920, interestingly enough. But what's important, I think, for us to understand as radical organizers who are trying to get to the roots of the issues, is to understand that those principles that were embodied in our fundamental law of this country are still working, both in terms of the form of practice in a relationship as well as the attitudes that we have. In terms of sexism, racism, and classism, there is no country in the Western world that has less protection for workers in terms of their conditions and wages than this country. And that makes sense. We started as a slave state, and we started with the concepts that workers were not equal to those who had property. So it's embodied in our forms of government as well as our attitudes, as well as the attitudes of the society. And so what that means to me is that as we think about doing our work, we have to think about two things. We have to think both about how the forms of activity are oppressive and how we begin to fight back against those oppressions. But equally important, we have to look at ourselves. There's no way that anybody can grow up in this country and not be affected by the thoughts of racism, classism, and sexism. Let's be honest. There's no way. It's too ingrained. It doesn't matter what home you grow up in. Those issues are there in various ways. And if we're talking about creating a planetary system of justice and equality for all, then we have to make sure that we're preparing. We have to exorcise the devils. We have to cleanse and purify our own thinking. We have to acknowledge, we have to have the courage to acknowledge the fundamental, I don't even know what the word is, psychological dilemmas of being an American. A psychological dilemma because, as Americans, we want to feel good about the country. We want to feel good about our country, but how can you feel good about a country that practices evil, that has practiced evil and continues to practice evil? You can feel good about people and their potential to change, but if you're going to change any practice, attitude, behavior that has been a problem for you, you have to recognize it. If you are in denial about any addiction, then you aren't going to be able to move beyond the addiction. Any counselor will tell you that. Well, in this country, we are a country that's addicted to power and control, and has used that power and control to enslave blacks, to take land from Native Americans, to take land from the Latinos, to oppress women, to oppress workers. That's our history. Don't blame Reverend Wright for talking the truth. As radical organizers, we have to be committed to speaking the truth about who we are as a country. If we don't speak the truth about who we are, how can we create anything different? You have to start with an analysis and an appreciation of all the dilemmas and all the contradictions to a planetary system of justice and equality if you're going to reach that. So when you hear people talking about Reverend Wright, say, yeah, we understand that you don't want to hear that, but we need to hear it. We need to hear it because we can't move forward to get to the root of our problem if we don't acknowledge the poison, the cancerous nature of what's at the roots of the founding of this country. And is that easy? No, but it's fundamentally important, right? Fundamentally important. That means it's radical. It's radical. It's an essential extremism in the face of ignorance. It's an essential extremism to define the evil practices of this country if we are going to move forward. That doesn't mean that we're defining ourselves as evil. It means that we're acknowledging that we are participating in a system that has to be cleansed in order to be healthy. So we're affirming in many ways our humanity when we acknowledge the pernicious practices of this country and our desire to cleanse ourselves of the effects in our psychology and our behavior. There's another aspect. There's another aspect of the day-to-day organizing that I want to touch on that relates more to the form of radical organizing. What I was talking about before is, kind of the spirit, what's in us, our view. But now when you come to the form of radical organizing, let me take 2 or 3 examples of what I see as the process of radical organizing in specific situations. Radical organizing starts the way any organizing does, right? Radical organizing has to start with an interrelationship between the organizer and people who have a problem. That's where it starts, because we're concerned about improving the immediate situation of people's lives. So we start there. And so City Life, just to take an example, has been organizing around tenants and tenant issues every year for 30 some years, looking at how to provide defense for families that are being attacked, but always looking at how to move to the next step. And so when the foreclosure crisis began to hit, and they saw tenants being moved out by the courts based on the buildings that were taken over by the banks, and the banks evicting the tenants, went to that next step. We need to organize our constituents to fight back and bring together our allies with them. So we move to the next level of saying that just because the banks have a, quote, legal right to do it, doesn't mean that there's a moral right, that there's a human right to do it, right? So the radical organizing by the nature of getting to the root of the problem and the understanding that the legal framework has been put in place to preserve the old, radical organizers understand that they're often going to find themselves confronted by the need to break the law because of a higher law, because of the law of our interrelationship to each other. And so, the whole movement of having tenants come together with allies to defend their rights to stay in the homes if they're willing to pay rent, is radical organizing. It's moving to the next stage. The next stage, though, is to pass laws. So even though we're at the legislature looking at just cause, passing a law around the fact that tenants couldn't be evicted if they're paying rents in the foreclosed situations, that courts have to review every foreclosure to see if, in fact, the banks and the financial institutions were engaging in fraudulent practices. They have to, because we know that that's what was going on in the vast majority of cases. We're pushing to get a moratorium. But that's not the end. But that's, if we got those passed, we'd have to celebrate. We'd have to say tremendous victory. But then we'd have to acknowledge the fact that 20 years ago, the system fell apart, right, with the housing crisis. Just in 20 years, we've had two major national disruptions. Isn't it time? I think a radical organizer would begin to say to herself or himself and people working with, it's time for us to begin to think about how do we set up a system where every few years it doesn't collapse around us? Isn't it insane? Isn't it insane to have a housing system, have a system of housing that can't sustain over a 20-year period in Boston and this country a reasonable housing situation? It's not unreasonable to have the homeless, and then it's not reasonable to have people who were trying to move ahead now find themselves being kicked out on the streets. And so that, as we look at the housing issue, the question is, how do we use this energy? How do we use this thinking to move to the levels of developing a system of managing housing in this country that really is just and equitable? What we have now is not that, and we can clearly see it. Take the quarry issue, another example. People organized around the quarries were still fighting to get change, but the reality is that what people are in the quarry movement are seeing is that even if we got rid of every barrier to the employment of people with criminal records, guess what? Guess what? We would still have, within many of our communities, 40 and 50% unemployment. The federal government did a survey of young men and women in this city between 16 and 24 and found out that there are 11,000, estimate of 11,000 who are out of school and out of work. And most of them don't have quarries. Out of school and out of work, most of them don't have quarries. What that says is that we have a fundamental employment problem. And we know that if you're shipping jobs overseas, when people are unemployed, and then saying, as AT&T apparently said recently, that the reasons we outsource our jobs to India are the fact that Americans essentially are too dumb to handle that responsibility. We've got a problem beyond Corey. We've got a problem beyond just the attitude toward black people or Latino people. We've got a fundamental issue that we have to look at as radical organizers about the nature of our employment situation. If we look at the credit problems, the same thing. We can look at the high interest rates, the fact that the politicians allowed the credit systems to persuade them to make it more difficult to get out of bankruptcy just before this crisis erupted. We can look at we can look at how the credit system is playing a part in this whole foreclosure piece. We can look at the fact that our tax dollars are bailing out a bank, a private bank, just like we bailed out the banks 20 years ago in the reinvestment trust. Isn't it time that we begin to think about our banking system and think about whether the relationship between these private banks and the American people needs to be changed? Whether our very banking institutions need to be changed, because we have to understand, how can we build a new world? How can we build a new world if the money is in the hands and the control of the banks that want to increase the gap between the rich and the poor? Can't happen, right? As long as we allow the banks to keep control, private banks to keep control of our money supply and how it's invested, we ain't going to go anywhere. It's don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that. And so radical organizing says that part of our process is to begin to look at the banking system and to think about how that can be reformed so it is part of a just and equitable system. Obviously, it's not. Now, let me end by just sharing a thought, and that is many of you could well be saying is, what's he doing? Chuck, he has radical ideas, but what he's talking about is so in the future and so down the road. Can we really get there? Let me say 2-3 quick things. One is, I believe if you look at history, you'll see that there isn't only the Darwinian evolution of the animal form. If you look at history, you'll see an evolution of consciousness. That is, you can see us as human beings progressing in our understanding of our relationship to each other. Even around race, which is perhaps the most difficult piece to deal with, the fact that they don't want, that the society doesn't want to admit the racism is an advance. That they feel a need to cover up the racism that exists in the society is different. When I was growing up, am I racist? Yeah, I'm racist. Politicians would admit, I have attitudes. Why? Black people are black people. White people are white people. We're supposed to be together. So we progressed in terms of at least a framework of hypocrisy, yes, but it's important. It's hypocritical, but it also represents a step forward because there is a feeling of a need to mask my feelings because I don't want to say that. You know what I'm saying? So consciousness does evolve, and so as I look at it, we are standing at the brink of the next leap forward in consciousness. We are standing at the brink of the next leap forward in consciousness. And our responsibilities of organizers is to work with our people to help all of us, organizers and people, progressing in terms of our consciousness, about our day-to-day interrelationship to each other, in terms of our consciousness about our need to struggle against what's here, in terms of our consciousness to understand that we have the responsibility to design the forms for the world that we are trying to create. And let me just stop with this thought. That is that everything, all the practices, all the forms of building, everything in the society is a product of thought. It's a material form, but when you really look at it, everything starts with a thought, right? Everything starts with a thought. What we are struggling against is a form that came out of the thinking of people in the past. And there are people who are trying to maintain it. I say that to say we have to appreciate the power of our minds. We have to appreciate our ability to think about forms of relationship that can create a global system of justice and equity. We have to believe that we are the ones who have the capability of coming up with that new thinking. Why are we the ones? We are the ones because we are struggling with the contradictions and the pain of the day-to-day society. And out of that struggle and challenge to what is not right and evil, will come the thoughts. I do believe in a divine mind. And so I believe that when you struggle to eliminate what is the debt growth, what needs to, if you're out in the farm, every once in a while you need to burn the fields off. And I'm not saying burn down America at all. but you need to clear away the growth. You need to clear away the growth in order to let the new growth come up. We have to clear away the old, but while we're clearing away the old, we have to be listening to our thoughts. The thoughts and sharing our thoughts with each other, because it's the thinking that we have that will define what we plant. what becomes the new growth. And so I just want to end to say that Malcolm X, I was over at Harvard in Memorial Hall in 1961 and heard Malcolm X give a speech. And one of the things he said it in the speech, and I just flipped to another thing he said. And one of the things he said was, you can't bake cats in an oven and expect them to come out as biscuits, right? So he was essentially saying that we need to really look clearly at the situation and analyze and not let our feelings cloud our vision of what was real. The other thought, though, was that said, when a fire would strike the plantation, the Negroes who were in the house, the house slaves, would say, "Master, master, what do we do?" And the slaves out in the fields would say, "Thank God, thank God. Yeah, we don't know where we're going. Yeah, we don't know what's happening. But thank God the master is going to be busy trying to save his plantation. That's going to give us space to build something for ourselves." As we look at the fact that I think we are seeing the collapse of the paradigm that we have been subjected to for the last 287 years in this country, collapsing. I think we see it collapsing. I think if you really look at it, the threads are coming apart. Our responsibility is to say to all of us, yeah, it's a difficult situation. Yeah, any change is difficult when you see a whole system begin to collapse. But we need to say, did you like the way America functioned yesterday? Do you like the way we're functioning today? And if you don't, then this is an opportunity. That is, if we don't like the way this country has been functioning, and we can see its basic underpinnings in terms of its financial system beginning to collapse and erode, we shouldn't be sad about that. We should help those of us who are feeling the pain move beyond that, but we should welcome it as the opportunity to more clearly move forward to build the world that we want. We can't get to the world we want as long as the practices that have been going on continue. And so when we see America imploding, the American economic system imploding, don't be scared. From my perspective, that's the universe helping us to move forward. That's the universe moving out of the way, the old system, so that we can move to the new. And the key question is, Jim Brown said to Dick Pryor after he almost burned himself to death. Dick said, the question is, what you gonna do? Jim Brown said to Dick Pryor, the question is, what are you gonna do? Right? And that's our question. What are we gonna do? We're committed to being radical organizers. But what's particularly important about today and particularly important about tomorrow and the next day is that we continue to think, acknowledge our feelings, but use our thought, because it's thought that has been used to enslave us. It's thought that we can use to free us. Thank you.